Okay, good. That's in a sense brought a kind of pious hush. Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Betts, one of the fellows of the European Studies Center and member of the history faculty. On behalf of the European Studies Center and St. Antony's College, it is my great pleasure this evening to introduce this year's Richard von Weizsäcker Visiting Fellow. As most of you know, the fellowship was named in honor of a distinguished former German president who passed away 10 years ago in 2015. Von Weizsäcker, of course, was a great figure of German-British relations and an ardent champion of Europeanism, and thus the fellowship is aptly named for him. As many of you also know, the German Visiting Fellowship here at St. Antony's has been running for some 70 years and has brought preeminent German historians and social scientists to Oxford for 3 generations. Professor Tony Nichols, the founder of the European Studies Center and longtime professor of German history here at Oxford, along with Professors Timothy Garden-Ash and Jane Kaplan, skillfully looked after the fellowship over the years, and we're very grateful to them for their efforts. No less important, as the Volkswagen Foundation has been extremely generous in underwriting this important initiative of intercultural understanding and bridge building, all the more so in the aftermath of Brexit, and we thank them for their long-standing support. So now let me turn to our main event and featured speaker tonight, Professor Miriam Ruerup. Miriam is director of the Moses Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies and is also professor of European Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam. She studied at the universities of Göttingen and Berlin and has held visiting fellowships in Berlin, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Leipzig, and Washington, D.C. In Hamburg, Miriam directed the Institute for German Jews for 10 years before moving to Potsdam in 2020. Her specific research interests are German Jewish history, National Socialism and memory culture, gender, human rights, diasporas, and statelessness. Miriam is the author of several books, 3 edited collections, and dozens of academic essays, including the volume on space and spatiality in modern German Jewish history, which was published with a former von Weizsäcker fellow, Professor Simone Lesich. Miriam's first book on Jewish student groups in Imperial Germany and the Weimar Republic, published in 2008, is a pioneering study of how German Jewish students at German universities develop new identities of belonging at the crossroads of inclusion and exclusion, most notably nationalism and Zionism. Her second book, Alltag und Gesellschaft, Everyday Life and Society, which was published in 2017 and was just published in English last year, expands on this history of tracing the changing status of Jews in German history from the 1870s to the end of the Second World War. In it, she elegantly excavates the interactions between Jews and other Germans over these turbulent decades. Here she goes beyond the history of political elites and focuses instead on the sites of social encounter between Jews and other Germans, be it at school or university, at work, in civil service, in mixed marriages, and in neighborhoods, in clubs, and in civic activism. Her book is therefore a study of the evolving modes of German Jewish sociability from the second half of the 19th century through the 1950s. Miriam's more recent research moves beyond German Jewish interactions to explore a more tricky topic, namely the history of statelessness. But she doesn't approach the subject as an intellectual history of the concept's legal career, as some have done. Instead, she plumes the phenomenon of mass statelessness after both world wars from a social history perspective of individual experience, including gender. As we all know, the aftermath of both world wars saw huge numbers of so-called displaced persons with unclear national belongings, during which the international community sought to find a remedy for their plight and uprooted status legally and morally. Such work often fell to the League of Nations or the United Nations or other NGOs, but what interests Miriam are less the institutions and the people themselves who experience statelessness as dislocation and displacement, the loss of rights, and existential security. Miriam's lecture tonight, Beyond Belonging in Exile, How to Write an Almost Global History of the German Jewish Diaspora, will explore these themes through a different angle of vision. In so doing, Miriam sets out to challenge conventional approaches to contemporary European history by redirecting our attention to personal experiences, the state's treatment of refugees, and the forgotten histories of who did not fit within the borders of changing national communities. So with this in mind, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ruerup as this year's Richard and Weizsäcker visiting fellow.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this very kind introduction. Bar is set really high now. Let's try to meet some of the expectations with which you probably came, and which are also the big questions of my upcoming year here in Oxford. So I want to start really with a big note of gratitude already at the beginning of this year for making it possible for me to work and do research. And actually, let's start with thinking and reading. After 5 years of really mainly administering a big institute. So going back to my own research brought me here with 2 research projects that I always had the feeling there is a link, and I completely lost the link. And for this lecture, I now try to bring it back. And at least in my mind, it clicked at some moment. I hope you won't leave this room thinking, no, this doesn't click at all. And if you leave that room with that sense, then please let me know what's not clicking, so as to help me in the upcoming year to make that into some comprehensive story. Also, already now, I want to thank the European Studies Center, Antony, and all other colleagues for this really warm welcome here. This atmosphere is inspiring already the first 3-4 weeks that I've been here. So that's amazing. Thank you very much for everyone who was on the committee to choose me, etc. And the Volkswagen Foundation. The only downside is there's no beetle anymore waiting for the Volkswagen Fellow, as I've heard was the case in former times. So bear in mind, it's many open questions, but it's also some ways or suggestions of how I can proceed with these open questions. I'm not used to working with it. See, I'm not used to working with this. So what you see here is the title of the cover of my dissertation, not because I want you to read the German title, but because I want you to look at the pictures. Let's start with how I first started thinking about the idea of belonging and of how people who had experienced not belonging, which is immigration, expulsion, etc., came up with new ideas of belonging. What you see here is a group of German Jewish student fraternity members. You see them in their full colors, and you see some bandages from the recent fencing. So it's very much German student fraternity actions that you see depicted here. What's interesting is that when these German Jewish student fraternities, you see my dissertation ended with the year 1937, when they moved to the new countries of immigration and diaspora, they remained members of their fraternities and remained so very actively. So, for example, in 1954, when the old boys of the Sprevia, which is the one on the top, met in Palestine, sent around a circular note to the common old boys in 1945 who had made it to Palestine, then Israel, sent out a note saying, now it's 1954, it might be that you receive German restitution money, compensation money. You might even think about getting your passport back, but if you do so, you will not be considered a member of our fraternity anymore. And if, for those who know fraternities, I don't know how it is in the British context, in the German context, that's like a social ban and really destroys your public social life. So that was quite a meaningful threat, which shows a very determined relation to the former German citizenship and to the new German Israeli citizenship in Israel by then. Again, 30 years later, in 1983, Charles Mayer, born as Karl Mayer in Berlin, was buried in Los Angeles. his son was rather surprised. A very eminent scholar of German Jewish history, Michael Meyer, was rather surprised that the whole Sprevia, old boys, that those at least who were still alive, showed up at the funeral in full colors in 1983 to put his father to rest. Probably they were all aged 74 or older, put his father to rest in full colors on the coffin. So this just shows you how long the trajectory is of having been member of a Jewish student fraternity, which is a very German national concept of belonging, then having emigrated from Germany to other countries, to the US, to Eretz Israel, later than Israel, and to still somehow feel this or live this connection to that state. So that's basically of how I try to combine those two projects that I will mention now into one. The structure, you have seen it briefly, of my talk is I'll briefly talk in this the first part on these two projects and terminologies, just so you know what I mean when I talk about diaspora and statelessness. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Then on how this new statelessness and diaspora even came about, and then on those three different angles of answers to the experience of statelessness and expulsion and living in a diaspora, hopefully bringing those two concepts or projects into one in a meaningful way. So just to give you a brief idea of what I mean, at least when I talk about diaspora. Classically, those of you who are familiar with Jewish history, for example, or studies, will know the religious relation to it. It stems in the Jewish context from the idea from the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, destroyed 6th century before Christ, and the longing of the Jewish people back to Zion, to Jerusalem. That's the idea of the Jewish, very briefly and superficially, of the Jewish diaspora. So it comes with the idea of a scattering of people by a forced expulsion and by a connection that stems from this memory and the remembrance of something that has been, of a common shared past. It also is not only a religious word, but it's even a scholarly term sometimes. So as a scholarly term, it's being used, for example, to compare different minorities that were established in different countries by migrations. We have it with the Greek diaspora in Europe, which is one of the research projects here at the center. We have it with different other diasporas. The Italian diaspora, also under Mussolini, is a very strong case of a political diaspora, and that was involved politically. And what I do is I try to look at the German Jewish diaspora, which is it just comes like a word, but this term as such is already something that can be conflictuous, because in calling it a German Jewish diaspora, the center of longing is Germany and not Zion or Israel anymore, the biblical Israel, but is Germany. So what I consider the German Jewish diaspora, and this is coming from a big project of the Weizsäcker Institute, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, is this longing back to the country that one has lost. So the case study of the fraternities would be one possible venues of looking at people who had experienced statelessness and yet still felt connected to their former country. It's as Deborah Dwork and Robert von Pelt have written when they wrote about Nazi refugees or refugees from Nazi Germany. They said fleeing does not write refugees out of the story. It simply takes the story elsewhere. And this is how I look at those people who were expelled from Germany and were then living in other countries, looking back at Germany and keeping the ties to Germany in different ways. And my specific angle always is the angle of statelessness and of citizenship and passports, respectively, the loss of passports. Just so this is really somehow moving very slowly. I'll try the arrows. The arrows are better. Okay. So this is the project I just mentioned that of the Weizsäcker Institute and in connection with the Moses Mendelssohn Center, which I'm heading on the German Jewish diaspora. My specific focus on this diaspora, and David is here, who's on the advisory board of that project, because he's also part of the Weizsäcker Institute of London. My specific angle always is the question of statelessness. So a few words on statelessness. And just so you understand what I mean by statelessness, there could be a whole lecture only on how did modern statelessness come about in modern times. I'm not going to give you that kind of lecture now, but we'll mention the main, let's say, 4 historical moments that are decisive here. One is the first at all after the First World War, when statelessness as a modern phenomenon even appeared in the world, with also new nation states as modern phenomena, as one could say. The second moment would then be in the 1930s with the National Socialists expelling German Jews and declaring different types of citizenships, producing a new category of statelessness, of people who were not born stateless, who didn't even have to move at all or be migrants at all in order to become stateless, because they were stripped of their citizenship, not because they violated any laws or anything, or fraud in denaturalization documents, but simply because they were Jews or considered illoyal citizens. The third moment then, I'm rushing through this, but I'm going to come back to some of the points, so you don't have to remember all of this. I just want to set you in the temporal atmosphere. The third moment then, and that's the most relevant one that I'm going to look at now, is post-Second World War, which is with the experience of first the minority rights regime in between the world wars that, for example, Timo has written about, my co-fellow here. With this experience in mind, and with knowing that the League of Nations kind of had not managed to help the refugees from Nazi Germany, with this experience in mind, how did the international community react? So that's the third angle and time slot that is important here. And already here, something else comes in. It's not only about Jewish statelessness anymore, but 2 big groups come into the picture now. One is the Palestinian Stateless Collective after the establishment of the State of Israel. And the other one is, of course, in decolonization, new colonies, and questions of how to deal with statelessness. And maybe we're going to touch about this on this topic, even with Anna's talk next week. The fourth moment, of course, is our current moment that we are experiencing, because discussions on statelessness are back on the agenda, and of decolonizing people, of stripping them of their citizenship for political reasons, ideological reasons, whatever. So that's the time frame. The geographical frame is I focus on Germany, even if I talk about German Jewish diaspora, or even if I talk about the United Nations or international law. My case studies mostly draw from from German history, which might sound contradictory to a global approach, but you will see that with looking at the German Jewish diaspora, it by itself becomes a global approach, or if you just stick to the national framework, you will not find answers to statelessness, and you won't understand the history. What I do want to do is I want to approach this whole thing as a history of experience of statelessness, as Paul has said in his introduction. So the big question is, of course, how can one do that? And how does experience come into play, and how can we extract it from the sources? And I hope I'll be able to show you how I work to understand, even by looking at so many conventions and United Nations discourses, etc., how nevertheless I try to always come back to the experience, or to sources that might tell us something about how statelessness was perceived and experienced. And even if we have all these 4 temporal steps still in mind, I hope some of you do, you will see how young this whole system is. So what is so self-understood for us today, and in my first weeks in Oxford, I always had the impression I never sit at a table with more than 2 people, if at all, with the same passport or passport history, or how they came to have that nationality. And this whole system is only 120 years old, one could more or less say. So I also want to invite us as those of us in the room who are historians, and those who are not historians, maybe even more, to even look at how it's only young, and therefore not necessarily something that one forever has to stay with, but can maybe even think beyond. One of these people who was affected by statelessness and who wrote about it very famously and whom you've certainly heard of, will be one of my longer quotes. That's why you have it here. It's Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig also was in the UK at some point as a migrant, as a refugee, and then also as a stateless person. But let me give you the quote. Before 1914, the earth had belonged to all. People went where they wished and stayed as long as they pleased. There were permits, no visas, and it always gives me pleasure to astonish the young by telling them that before 1914, I traveled, so you see, I kind of echo that. I traveled from Europe to India and America without passport and without ever having seen one. One embarked and alighted without questioning or being questioned. One did not have to fill out a single one of the many papers which are required today. The frontiers, which with their customs officers, police, and militia have become wire barriers, thanks to the pathological suspicion of everybody against everybody else, were nothing but symbolic lines which one crossed with as little thought as one crosses the meridian of Greenwich. This is, of course, very colorful in his nostalgia, and as you may know, he was so destroyed by losing his world of yesterday that he committed suicide in his exile country of Brazil after many steps along the way. So he's one of these figures that show the different challenges it really meant to be stateless, even if you're were a privileged person with a stable social and academic and capital monetary status. So even if he already suffered that much, just think of how people who might not have had his connections, his network, probably suffered by this passport regime that was then brought to the worst facet or phenomenon of it by the expulsions from Germany by the National Socialists. So let's move to the second big step, which is I'm trying to, some of you always look expectantly to the screen when I step here. It's usually trying to blacken it so you're not distracted by. Now comes one of these probably rather boring. That's why I want to have you focused on not on a quote there. Parts where I just want to walk you through what the Nazis did, because it's important to understand the way they went and why so many Jews were affected by statelessness and were kind of hit without enough preparation. The main thing is why they were hit without expecting it as strongly as it hit them was that the Nazis really followed very precise legal steps of stripping German Jews of their citizenship. Everyone knows of the Nuremberg laws, but even in Mein Kampf, even in the first party program of the NSDAP, the first thoughts about how to strip German Jews of their citizenship were part of the idea. So I'll just give you a few examples. And only 6 months after the Nazi rise to power, they already issued the first law that addressed everyone who was considered disloyal, which also affected not only Jews. Actually, it mainly affected social democrats, socialists, communists, intellectuals like Hannah Arendt, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, people who, as writers, were considered a threat, or as politicians were considered a threat. So by then, those were really individual revokes of citizenships. That was in July 1933. In 1935, before the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis issued another law which dealt specifically with the Eastern European Jews. And there they revoked or denaturalized all naturalizations of the Weimar Republic. By that, if you know something about demographics of German Jewry of the interwar period, you'll know that this really affected roughly 100 or more thousand Jews living in Germany who never either got German citizenship or never cared to really get German citizenship because they didn't need to, because they were married maybe to someone who was naturalized a Prussian or whatever German citizenship, and that felt safe enough. and they had not reclaimed their Polish citizenship, let's say, after the First World War. The thing, however, is that even those German Jews who witnessed that and who were not Eastern Europeans thought that it might not even affect them. Like Kurt Rosenberg, third generation German Hamburg lawyer, wrote, should a person immigrate? To where? Where is there a possibility for the wife and kids? You lose your citizenship. You will get an Nansen passport, longing for peace and quiet within, internal sense of unrest, day after day. So that's what he writes in 1933 in August, still not considering immigration for himself, but taking up aid positions as a lawyer to defend Eastern European Jews from the threat of being stripped of their citizenship. The next step, of course, is familiar to you. I'm sure I'll just name it, the Nuremberg laws, which introduced a new category or two categories of Jews. One was the imperial of Germans. One was the German national, which was considered the true, the imperial citizen, Reichsbürger. I don't know what the English word would really be, which is the Aryan true German heritage citizen, and the German national, which then is just an administrative term for those who soon had to be stripped, including, for example, Germans who were born Germans. In 1941, and that's the last step from Nazi legislation, in 1941, an additional decree was issued to this Nuremberg law, which said that everyone, and now we leave the individual expatriations of German Jewish citizens. It said everyone who had taken residence elsewhere was considered not a German anymore. So now, finally, in the National Socialist sense, everyone who had chosen to emigrate or had the luck of having emigrated by 1941, one must say, but even those who were deported to ghettos or camps were considered stateless. This meant also, by the way, and that's important to know, that you were losing all your belongings, and belongings also included rights for, let's say, retirement funds, insurance rights, etc. So people after the war, it's even sometimes relevant to this very day through inheritance laws. It touches upon sometimes even the third generation, this collective expulsion or expatriation and denationalization of German Jews. And that's the beginning of the German Jewish diaspora as we see it today. So now you might wonder, how is she actually really addressing this topic and how is she working? Please explain, and I hope I can explain. So these, for example, I already gave you one quote, which was the quote from Stefan Zweig. So of course, it's the easiest to first start with those people you knew were stateless at some point and who wrote about it, and then you try to find whether they published something in their novels. What you see here is the novel by Erich Maria Remarque, himself also denaturalized at some point. His book, interestingly enough, with different titles, always the same story. The German version was published after the English version. The English version is the precisest one. It's in 1939 with the title Flotsam, and you'll see why it's the precisest in my view. And the German version was published in exile. So here again, diasporic approach under the title, the very inconspicuous title, Love Your Neighbor, or your closest, or whatever the correct translation would be. And the film that was filmed after, again a bit later, thank you, was called So Ends Our Night. And I gave you the picture here because I think it's nice to see how it depicts the story, which would not necessarily tell you anything about National Socialism, flight, rescue, statelessness, helplessness, or documents. However, the closer we look at this novel, the more we see documents and discussions of statelessness and of the experience of statelessness. So just to give you the brief idea, the story says the Jewish student Ludwig Kern leaves Nazi Germany, leaves first to Vienna, which is in 1935. Then he's deported from there in 1938 after the Anschluss. He ends up in Prague, And there he's imprisoned again as a refugee, as an illegal refugee. And in this prison cell, from this prison cell is the next quote: "I don't belong in your crowd." They all looked at him. That's another prisoner. It's not the student. "I don't belong in your crowd." They all looked at him. "I have a passport, a country, a permit to stay here, and a permit to work." They were all silent. "Pardon the question," the Russian said presently in a hesitant tone, "but then why are you here?" "Because of my profession," the man explained haughtily. "I'm no fly-by-night refugee without papers. I'm a substantial pickpocket and professional gambler with full rights of citizenship." So I guess those of you, I mean, here you see three different types. First, the Russian is one who got the Nansen passport that I mentioned before, like after this First World War experience of statelessness. So that's the Russian. Then there is a normal criminal, and there's Ludwig Kern, who doesn't have papers, and obviously also other prisoners on which it's looked down. So for those of you who've read, and I assume there are many in this room who've read Hannah Arendt, maybe you also read that part in her big work on the origins of totalitarianism. The same person who yesterday was in prison only because he dared to exist, who was completely without any rights, constantly fearing deportation or internment. Now, all of a sudden, he enjoys full citizenship rights only because finally he has become an ordinary criminal. His jail sentence guaranteed him the constitutional rights that nothing else could have obtained for him once his citizenship had become doubtful. So you see how Hannah Arendt and Erich Maria Remarque really resonate, and how they seem to be really sources and documents of the same period. So that's how I try to weave refugee stories, experiences with reflections on statelessness in together, let's say, to compose the story or the history of experience of statelessness. The third step could then be to also look at legal deliberations, and that's something I do a lot, but never really present because it's pretty difficult for a historian to present legal documents and debates. But let me just give you the gist of one, which is Chief Justice Earl Warren. Those of you who are lawyers probably have heard that name. One of the justices of the US Supreme Court after the Second World War, used to work in the displaced persons refugee time directly after the end of the Second World War to help refugees in Europe, in the European theater. So after the war, now he was a Supreme Court justice in the US, and in a long court suit, I'm not going to go into details here, that dealt with a GI who had deserted during his stay in the Second World War in Morocco because he went for whatever. It was called desertion, so he was stripped of his US citizenship as a punishment. And Warren, after the war, in this Supreme Court case where it ended up after 10 years, in 1958, said the most fatal result of forced expatriation is the expatriate has lost the right to have rights. So again, for those of you who are familiar with Hannah Arendt, that's where biographical experience with reading of theories that Paul mentioned at the beginning interweave and intersect. So no, that's coming in a second. I want you to blacken it. I'm just going to skip the blackening. So what I'm always doing is whenever I come across a person in a legal document, I try to find out more about their biography, to find out whether there was any personal affiliation or connection or experience of statelessness. And surprisingly, with lots of those lawyers who dealt with citizenship with the loss of citizenship after the Second World War in the context of the United Nations, many of them had experience as stateless Jews or stateless Europeans or refugees in general. So there very much is there is a strong connection between experience and even legal deliberations, even in the realm of the United Nations. And we also have, I could talk about different films and novels endlessly here. We can see that the 50s are full of novels and reflections on this kind of statelessness. So I said I'm looking at diaspora always through the angle of statelessness. So let me just give you a few numbers so you get an idea of this diaspora, and that's the point where I show you this picture. The small picture is a map that was drawn by a child who fled Hamburg, I think. Sorry, I hadn't looked that up right before the talk. In 1938, and he drew this picture showing their way across the ocean to Montevideo, where they then ended up and found refuge. And down there, you see an excerpt of our map in this online project on the German Jewish diaspora. So the challenge is, of course, there were about 100 countries or more that took in German Jewish refugees. Not in all these countries did those German Jewish refugees remain, but in many they did. And even in countries like Shanghai, where it was only a transitional diaspora, as I would call it, there is a very strong connection of those German Jews who had survived the war in Shanghai to this day, traveling back to Shanghai, meeting as the former Shanghaiers. So something connected as this was the country that saved them from being killed by the Nazis. So just to give you an idea of the numbers, it's 250 to 300,000 German Jews who emigrated successfully from inner Germany in the Nazi sense. After 1938, another 150,000 from German-speaking Jews from the countries of Austria and the former Hungarian Empire also count into these German-speaking Jewry that I look at as through the lens of the passport and how they dealt with passports. Countries were very different in how they invited or welcomed or didn't welcome refugees, as you know, also probably from the case of Britain. And so I don't need to necessarily go too much into that. However, I want to mention that already then, and as you see, I keep coming back to this, already during this first establishment of a German Jewish diaspora, one of the problems in marks, quotation marks, that we face today was relevant, which is that in Eretz Israel with Zionism, a very new idea of a German Jewish settlement was established, which was not meant to be German at all. So to speak of a German Jewish diaspora, if we look at Eretz Israel and at the Zionist Yishuv, is highly problematic through the lens of the German Jews or of the Jews back then in Eretz Israel or in the Yishuv. Another question that is relevant to this very day is, or top point, is that one of the agreements the Zionist organizations have made with the German authorities in 1933 was the so-called Ha'avara agreement, a transfer agreement that helped basically establish establish the German or the Jewish diaspora in Israel. I now call it Israel, although I'm speaking about the Yishuv. So German Jews had the option of bringing products from Germany through the Ha'avara agreement to Palestine, which meant they gave money to the Nazis and could spend that money in Palestine back then or in the Yishuv. So we see an entanglement of those stories of that region already then. So I mentioned over 100 countries, roughly 300,000 to 400,000 German-speaking Jews who had successfully, luckily immigrated from Germany under National Socialist rule. Only roughly 5% really returned to Germany. The rest stayed in their countries of exile. What's interesting, however, so countries of exile meant, for example, New Zealand, Australia, South America, the US, etc., and also very small and remote countries. Again, a brief snapshot on how I then approach it some of you may have seen me with this notebook and thought, why, gee, that is so cheating. Somehow every tourist buys this. But for me, again, it's a source. And it's not only a source from the time itself, the book, which was published in 1958, but it's also a source of how it's remembered. Because if you look at, and I would love, maybe at the end, maybe at the workshop, I'm going to give the talk about Paddington. I'll just give you a few hints, because I assume if you read it, it's a few years ago, either with your kids or when you were a kid yourself. But it really has quite a few things where you see how much the refugee history is reflected in it. First of all, the literary agent of Michael Bond was a former student fraternity member, lawyer in Germany, who had made it as a refugee to the UK and became a literary agent, where he helped publish this book. Then, not Brown, what's his name? Michael Bond's family himself had taken in 2 kids that came on the Kindertransport. And then I'll just give you the short quote that really is like the first thing where you think, okay, now it's on the 4th page. It says, "There aren't many of us left where I come from." So of course I can read it into it. And if that would be the only quote, one wouldn't really look at it as a source of that time. But then it goes on, and even legal issues come in. There it says, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And then he tries to get out by not having a name. So you have all these kinds of things that are reflected in memoirs as well. And that's the, that's from, that's the Portobello Road locations. That's the next step I would then do. So first step is look at the fictions. The second step is look at all the locations that are mentioned in the fiction. Portobello Road is also known not only for its flea market or whatever, antiques market, but also for a chance for immigrants to have a first step of integration into society, into English society, to make a living, basically. And Paddington finds his refuge in Portobello Road in the antiques shop of a trader who was himself a Jewish refugee, Ruerup, and who, by the way, also relates to Hungary, because it's in 58. And so there are different versions. In some, he's a Hungarian, and some others he's a Jew. Maybe he's both. But you just see it being played around. And if you look at memoirs, that would be the next step. You then see how it's also part of memoirs on the Kindertransport. How the question of what to do with one's citizenship or the experience of the loss of citizenship, how it's reflected. And here, Ruth Barnett, who wrote this book on Person of No Nationality, in this chapter, very much in the middle, she explains, I wanted to pass this around for those who maybe get tired in the meantime and want to have a look at children's stories. Here, she very much and interestingly tells the difficult reflections she had on whether she should or should not become a British citizen. And that brings me to the next part, the part in 3 steps again, which is what were possible answers by those who were stateless and whom I would consider as part of a German Jewish diaspora. So just to give you an idea again of now we are in post-45. You saw with Paddington, of course, we're in the post-war period with the reflections on statelessness. Those who survived the war on European soil were then considered, I'm really running through this now, I just give you the landmarks, so to speak, were considered displaced persons. The idea of the Allied forces or powers was repatriation was the goal for those displaced persons. So the whole lens through which the Allies approached the refugee problem was the lens of nation states. However, the German Jews who had fled, or also the East European Jews who had survived, did not want to consider themselves as nationals from the countries that had not helped them. So they very much preferred a new category, and all of a sudden, of course, it's not sudden, but within only a few months of this post-war history, those displaced persons are introduced with a new category in the American zone of occupation. The British were not very willing to accept that category for reasons we can talk about later, which was the category of the non-nationals or non-repatriable and refugees, which meant for the first time in history now, since the introduction of this passport regime and of strong nation states, statelessness was an asset because Jews were exempt from this repatriation policy, and that was exactly what they were longing for. The Zionist organizations, as help organizations for those displaced persons, of course, brought in another angle, which then is another approach to statelessness that I'm going to touch upon in the next few minutes soon, which is a very national answer to statelessness again, which in the DP time is proto-national, I would call it, or pre-national, pre-state citizenship. That sounds very theoretical now, but just consider this. In the displaced persons camps, there were two campaigns by Zionist organizations, the Jewish Agency among them. One was for a tax system, and the other one was for a conscription campaign, Mas Lochem, a tax for the fighting people, and a Giyus, like to pull into conscription of DPs. And they really collected a lot of taxes for the Haganah movement, for example, and people who joined as volunteers in order to organize illegal immigration to Palestine. So you see two typical citizenship duties, army service and taxes, is here introduced before even a state exists. So that's an interesting answer, a national answer to a new non-national collective category of the displaced persons. But there were also, of course, other answers, which are the individual answers, and I want to speak about them very briefly here, because I thought it's at least relevant here in the UK to mention this person once and this association, because not everyone went to either Palestine, the Yishuv, or later Israel, or returned to Germany, but some stayed in their countries of immigration, such as Werner Rosenstock, by the way, another old boy of the German Jewish student fraternity. He was born in 1908, and he became the general secretary of the Association of Refugees, of Jewish refugees in the UK, and was their main leader for more or less 40 years, and published the AGR informations. And this is just to show you again of how I read through those sources. So what you can see here is, for example, you have a general meeting that's taking place in never mind. After the war, it takes place after the war. Some of you might be able to read it at this moment, and it deals, among others, with restitution and compensation. What you see is it's still in German, but parts of it are in English. So you have this. That's where I would see you see this connection back to Germany through language and also through dealing with legislation that is being issued in Germany, but they are arriving in England. Eva Reichmann was a historian sociologist. She used to work in the Zentralverein, and she then worked in the Wiener Library, which was a very, and is to this day, a very important institution for emigre scholars and German Jewish emigres as such, where they kind of felt like at home in exile. Overall, newspapers were one of the main sources to connect and to reconnect, both with family members after the Second World War, but also to reconnect with issues that are relevant in Germany, and that were relevant to those people who were affected by the expulsions through the Jews, through the Nazis. And those newspapers were also those mediums through which they were informed about how to deal, for example, with their open citizenship questions and with compensation issues, or with how to deal with legal issues in general. Another approach to or answer to Jewish statelessness and to the experience of it was, I mentioned it at the beginning, that some of them were very involved there, was, so that's the second answer, the universal answer to the experience of statelessness. And here again, we see quite a few former stateless people being involved in the new passport regime being created, or the new, I would rather call it, or not I, scholarship calls it, the human rights regime and experience of the post Second World War phase. I have two short examples just to show you on where the post-45 past human rights regime connects, or where the United Nations, when they deal with statelessness, where they pick up historically, which is, again, I'm always very happy when I find one of these sources. That's just the fun source, kind of. It's a Superman clip from 1940, where Stalin and Hitler are brought to Geneva to be tried for crimes. It's not then called crimes against humanities yet, but that's what it's gonna be at some point. And a not funny but very factual document that is from the same period. Okay, I see. Okay, I'll go back once more. Is the Nansen Pass itself, which then served as the blueprint. This is no pun. It just happens to be blue. It's not blue in every country. The blueprint for how to deal with statelessness after the Second World War. And this titre de voyage is a travel document, for example, that you see I always keep coming back to Palestinians because they are one of the big roots of statelessness. But this is one, and also I'll explain why there's another reason to come back to this, which is handed out to people who are stateless and which protects them from not being let back into their country of residence. So this means it's not something like a citizenship. It means in general, they should be treated like accepted, recognized foreigners, asylum seekers, etc., although they are not. That's the theory. The practice is they have to prove that they are stateless, and proving that one is stateless is one of the biggest challenge of the 20th century in this context of documents and resolving of refugee issues, because how do you prove something that's not there? What we can see, however, is that many of those affected who were involved in the context of the United Nations bringing about, for example, the convention to prevent future statelessness, were not only affected themselves by statelessness, but also playing around with other ideas of citizenship and belonging. And I'm just quickly going to show it to you and not go into this, because that's part of what I want to do in the coming months, because Britain was very, very active in this scene, is the world movement of world citizenship. And what you see here is an example of a family from 1972, 71, that travels Europe on a planetary passport. And a planetary passport is, of course, an invention, and but it's such a strong symbol that they can travel without problem, and even not imaginable today that the British border police lets them pass with the explanation, well, we don't have an entry stamp because we traveled on our passeport planétaire. So with all this universal approaches, we should finally, and that's the last point I'm going to make, also look at national and particularist answers to statelessness. One of the national answers would have been, and I have to mention that at least and make a few reflections on that, would have been to reinstate collectively all German Jews, formerly German Jews, collectively into German citizenship. So to reinstate them into the status quo ante, which would have been 1941. So there, with Paul Weiss, another lawyer who then lived here in the UK, did his second doctorate at the London School of Economics, he contradicted this and said, no, you cannot make us forcibly Germans again after having expelled us first and stripped us of our citizenship. So interestingly enough, when I started this project, I thought, oh, interesting, they don't give them the German citizenship back. How dare they? But no, it was a Jewish agency, a voice of Jewish agency to say, you stripped us of our citizenship. We want to decide if we want to be Germans again or not. We want to have the right to be Germans again, but we don't want to be forcibly reincorporated into your nation. This would have affected by then roughly 150 to 200,000 survivors of those German Jews. No, that's wrong. 150,000 maybe. In Germany, that's what I wanted to say. Of those German Jews who were expatriated, only more or less 15 to 20,000 decided to return, and many of them who returned did not apply for German citizenship again, did not get a German passport, but traveled and on their whatever country of immigration passport and wanted to stand to remain exiled and Jewish diaspora people, so to speak, but by choice and not by force. That's the big change. And this change could only come about because, of course, we had the United Nations Convention that introduced means and instruments to protect stateless people after the Second World War. Another particularist answer was the Jewish Zionist one. And here it's really interesting. That could be another full talk. The debate, and there is a whole library also on this, the debate between Zion and the diaspora. Because in the Zionist perspective, the diaspora was something that was to be overcome with the establishment of the State of Israel. There was no need anymore for a Jewish diaspora, certainly not in Germany, but more or less also not in other places. And what Israel then introduced was the so-called law of return, which interestingly paralleled very much the paragraph or Article 116 of the federal of the Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, which addresses the German expellees and makes them German citizens, even if they have never set foot on German soil. And it's the same idea, and it links to Spanish and Portuguese developments of the recent years of thinking of a people as a collective without this people being connected to a certain territory or soil. So with the law of return, Israel introduced an idea of a citizenship for people meant to be part of the Israeli people. And some of the declarations, and the Declaration of Independence, for example, says the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved their independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. It goes on and on and on. And that's why the very essence of Zionism is to populate Eretz Israel with multitudes of Jews, is what Ben-Gurion then made out of this after already in the displaced persons camps, but mainly, of course, after 48, after the establishment of the State of Israel. And it's the idea of the mission of gathering the exiles. That's a quote now, that the law of return really wants to be. And of course, since there were also non-Jews living on the territory, there were also other laws of nationality and citizenship. There was the law of citizenship that was introduced to include also the Palestinians, but with very different conditions and articles. For example, they had to prove permanent residence and presence within the territory, which proved pretty difficult after the War of Independence and the expulsions then. But so you see how, in a way, I could say how history repeats itself, but I would never say in a sense of it's the same category, but we see the long threads of how things are being discussed and how blueprints are developed and how they are taken up for new situations. So here, a German law of return, citizenship law, now is the law making Jews worldwide. So the German Jewish diaspora, just as any Jewish diaspora, possible citizens of the state of Israel, which produces an extraterritorial citizenship, which then again could be declared as a kind of universal idea of citizenship, because it at least disconnects from one of the basic characters of citizenship, which always says you have to live in a joint, collective, common territory. And lastly, and that's the final remark, is this German Jewish diaspora, and not only the German Jewish diaspora today, we're now at the fourth temporal slot, so to speak, is coming back to Germany. I mean, for most of you, it was very actual, and you've all witnessed this in your news after Brexit, for example, with applications of third generation former German Jews trying to get German citizenship for their grandchildren, etc., successfully. And the German citizenship law was amended only 1.5 years ago with a very flexible, and it was even called Wiedergutmachungseinbürgerung, so naturalization or institution of citizenship to do right the moral wrong of the Nazis. For those who, I mentioned them at some point in the expulsion part of the Nazis, even for those who had never had German citizenship, but lived, for example, as permanent residents, former Polish citizens, as naturalized or Eastern European Jews in Berlin, Hamburg, or wherever other city of a German state. And I have to mention this, although I didn't go into detail about this discussion, but I think she's the niece of Richard von Weizsäcker. Esther von Weizsäcker was one of the lawyers bringing this law with her expertise, not as a politician and not as a lawyer advising, but with her expertise. She brought this law about in the German current society. So I'll end again with both a joke and a serious document. Jacob Robinson, I mentioned him here and there, one of those lawyers involved in the interwar minority regimes, is seen here signing on behalf of Israel, although he never had Israeli citizenship, in front of the United Nations, the convention relating to statelessness. And you see Paddington, who only a year ago received British citizenship, which I really find not just funny, but it really shows us how relevant this topic is today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for the wide range and also multi-layered talk.
Oh, you have my pen.
Yes, you're right. I have this. We kind of draw on novels and memoirs, children's books to kind of return us all to the openness of the 1940s and early 50s, using statelessness as a kind of case study in terms of that history. Do we have questions? I'm happy to lead with one. Okay, start off right away then. Please identify yourself. That'd be useful for the rest.
Okay, also known as the second University Center. Thank you very much, Miriam. That was fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you about two specific things that you've been mentioning. The one is more conceptual, because you've been using the term statelessness, and how we understand it in the case of German Jews is that there was expulsion there, they left by force and all that. So that's the kind of understanding. But there is also statelessness with other cases of those that cannot create the state that they want. So if we are, for instance, are thinking of the Kurds, for example, or even within Spain, the Catalans, many of them are represented by citizenship that they don't really like, or they're forced to use. So that's one thing that has to do with the etymology of the term that you're using, and to what degree, that's a more flexible kind of context. The second one has to do with how you engage with the notion of diaspora in this German Jewish case, because you are kind of using a lot the citizenship and that part of more formal institutional identity of them. But diaspora is also a much wider context in terms of how you define your self-identity, how you self-identify, how do you link with the homeland as well? Are you nostalgic or not? How do you integrate with with the place where you go next? How are you dealing with those issues in terms of this particular diaspora case that you're talking about?
It's great questions. Thank you. So not the state they want. Yeah, so the different causes of statelessness. With the Jews, it's not only the expulsion or stripping of of citizenship in Germany as an experience, but it also, for example, women were also affected by marrying a stateless person. They became stateless, for example, or by marrying a person from a different nationality that did not automatically include a wife through marriage into the new nationality. So also Jews were affected by different kinds of statelessness, just this as to start us off with. And by the way, there's a very interesting case after the Second World War where the nationality of married women is debated in front of the United Nations, and then, of course, also in all countries that want to ratify it or not. And it's a Greek national in Germany, in West Germany, who then claims German citizenship, the right to German citizenship through gender equality, because he says if women now, to be protected against statelessness, get rights through marriage, he, as a Greek, should also get the right to become a German citizen. So, okay, but how do I address the self-identification? What I do, if I would look at everything in diaspora with over 100 countries and with all the aspects that are involved, we would all need to work on it collectively in order to finish it. That's what we do with a website, hopefully. That's the challenge we are trying to tackle with a website. What I do is I always have this, I zoom in on how do those individuals, for example, reflect upon, do I want the German passport back or not? The student fraternities, or Werner Rosenstock, who's in charge of the Association of Jewish Refugees, he also reflects at length of should I reapply for a German passport or not. And if he becomes a British citizen, he writes about it in the AGR, and he actually warns the fellow German Jews, or formerly the German Jews, not to become too British, because that would be over assimilation, with which one also had bad experiences back in Germany. So that's how I try to address it.
Okay, Sandra, introduce yourself, please.
I'm Sandra Leon. I'm Ramon Arete's visiting fellow this year at the European Study Center. Thank you very much, Miriam, for your wonderful talk. I was fascinated. I have two questions. The first one connects to what often said. It's about identity. So to what extent Jewish diaspora develop their identity? Because on the one hand, they have been deprived by their state of citizenship. How that affected the way in which they develop their national identity, in connection also to the land that welcomed them. And the second question is, to what extent Jewish diaspora, German Jewish diaspora is different to other types of diaspora? Because you have talked about the way, they're developed, the way they were welcomed in Palestine, in Israel, later on. And it seems to me, from what you said, that this is a very particular group. So I would like you to maybe to develop it further as compared to other groups.
Thank you. Again, great questions. So deprived. One of the important things, of course, elements of diasporas emerging is that you, in theory at least, need, of course, a positive connection to where you were expelled from. So what they found as a positive connection was culture, language, knowledge, and heritage, culture, cooking. Cookbooks are one of the important sources for other people working on German Jewish diaspora. Seriously, because you can also see how it changes and how, anyway. So, but you're right. How is it possible to even connect back to Germany? So I would say this is the one thing. It's a certain nostalgia that, of course, always reflects back to the golden Weimar years. I would even say part of scholarship on Jewish studies that we see today is probably tainted is maybe not the right word because it's like affected by this angle. Because if we only look at the golden years of Weimar, it's very much the refugee voice that probably wrote the first German Jewish histories after the Second World War in institutions like the Wiener Library or the Leo Baeck Institutes that were established in different exile countries. So yeah, it's a nostalgia, I would say, and it's the language and culture that they refer to. And in practice, actually, what's really important is that, and that's where they differ fundamentally from other diasporas, is the social profile of the German Jewish diaspora was a very educated one, also in comparison to other Jewish diasporas. It's not only to other German diasporas, but Jews from Eastern Europe. In South Africa, for example, the German Jews met Jews from Eastern Europe, I think a lot from the Baltic states even, not even, for some reason they were always, so anyway. And they were very different also in the way how they lived their religion, from traditions, etc. But also in what professions they could look for. So the profile, the demographic profile was overtly well-educated academics, free professions, lawyers, doctors. So things that didn't necessarily make it easy to settle in a different country, either because all positions were gone, England didn't want to have any doctors, or because they didn't know the national law. I mean, as a lawyer of German law, what would you do in France or wherever in another law? Yeah, those I would say are the main differences.
Timothy Garton, European Studies Centre, fascinating project, Miriam. I want to pick up your last point about the grandchildren requesting German citizenship. The largest single country from which those applications come under the now amended Article 116, paragraph 2, is of course Israel. And the numbers have soared in recent years. I just pulled up the figures. 2023, nearly 14,000 total applications worldwide, of which more than 9,000 from Israel. I've talked to a couple of them. One of them said to me, well, you know, Germany now is such a civilized country, such a tolerant country, and then his word was such a well-balanced country, by explicit contrast with Israel today. So I wonder how that fits into your story. I mean, in a way, one could construct an arc from your students on your first slide, for whom Germany was absolutely their country, to the total rejection after the Second World War, but in the third generation, an embrace of Germany as a model of civility and tolerance, by contrast with the Promised Land.
The irony of it, right? It's really amazing. That's the most striking, and that's why I actually tried, but that's so new that I couldn't include it. I didn't want to include it in this talk yet. But I think this line I wanted to try to lay out here and there, or the narrative of that it affects also the Palestinian case, is something that's relevant today because see that some of the conflicts in Germany, there are some conflicts that are waiting to erupt. And one of the conflicts I would say is around citizenship, because you have the stateless Palestinians in Germany who are kind of protected by this blue passport as stateless under the United Nations idea, but they don't have a right to citizenship. And then you have Israelis, Jewish Israelis who've never set foot in Germany who have the right to German citizenship. So that's maybe the fifth temporal time slot that we can discuss in a few years. Hopefully it's not going to be a conflict, but I think it's very relevant. And I don't know, I only touched upon it in the very last remark. I would call it something like diaspora is coming back, but with a question mark. Because it's an imagined coming back. Many just need the passport as a reassurance. And you see the same thing, by the way, after the Second World War. Some of those who reclaimed their German citizenship didn't do it because they had planned to go to Germany, just because they didn't feel certain in their country of immigration.
Okay, Anna. Thanks.
Yes, I'm an answer. Deacon Fellow. Thank you, Miriam. I think it was amazing. I really have to say so. And I appreciate that you say that this is a normal global history. And that finally resetting all of us doing global history into what we can do alone and what we cannot. So I think I have 2 questions actually. One is thinking about the drawing of the kid that you showed us. So from the old Heimat to the new Heimat. So do you also look into how that was perceived? Because you spoke of experience, but I'm wondering about sentiments. How was it felt? And it probably kind of goes back also to the question of the integration, new communities, whether this German Jewish identity got modified in different places, as really as, whether it changed depending on where you were, with your social context and cultural context with the societies you touch upon. I saw Algeria, so you mentioned South Africa. How did it work? In order not to make an historical category as identity historical itself. Mm-hmm. I think there's a bit of the risk here. And then the second question, it's about citizenship. Because it seems to me that what you're working on, also because of connecting the diaspora and statelessness, it's a really legal civil rights definition of citizenship, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, and then I was wondering how much does it really have to do with the connection of nationality, especially, and what people can do in nation states with that citizenship, because, better than anyone else with a double citizenship, and I know it myself, but the question is really, is this history challenging this Weizsäcker citizenship nationality connection that we cannot really get rid of, or is it? I know it's a big question, but as a former historian of citizenship in France and the US, I think that's the issue we're dealing with, because what you made me think is that either way, there is this idea not of the land or of the soil, but what the Italians would call jus sanguinis, and so of this ethnic connection, which is just as problematic, right? Yeah. So you can have someone born in Brazil being Italian without having an Italian passport, without having ever set foot in Italy. I think many countries do. But thank you. I think it's terrific what you're doing. And I love the sources. Please show me again. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, no, go ahead. We'll take that and we'll start.
Yeah, the old country, new country, that's of course one of these paradigms. In a way it contradicts, but it also it's the same, the other side of the flip side of the coin, probably, of this nostalgic view of how to look at history, that it always proceeds and gets better or something. I mean, of course, it's a kid that draws that and reflects what his parents say, etc. We also have the stories of basically the diaspora coming back. On the website, there's one of Sonja Mühlberger, who was a Shanghai refugee. She was born on the road on the way to Shanghai or something. And she came to Germany at the age of 6 or something, not knowing a word of German and wondering what those trees were in the forest. So she has an experience of complete estrangement as a child going back with her parents to Germany. So that's something that probably also relates to this, how did it change over time, and especially the generational change. So there are 2 changes over time. One, I would say, is indeed generational, like in families, and Ruth Barnett, the memoir that I showed, reflects on this a lot, of being lost in England and not understanding that it's about being saved, and then being forced back to parents that you don't know. And so she also tells the story of reinventing oneself and one's own belonging. So indeed, I would say I don't really work on nationality as such, but as on the reflection on nationality, or the experience of having lost it, and how you answer to this experience.
Okay, I think we're with 7 people on the list, so I think we'll start to pair them up. Deanna, and then you. I think I don't know your name, so identify yourselves, please, if you don't mind. Yeah. Let's be louder.
Oh,
Can't hear
louder?
you.
I'm Diana. I'm researching on the German unification, and thanks for this intriguing talk. I would like to ask something about I mean, you already talked about it a bit. Something one might call intersectional strategies of naturalization, because we see in those newspapers who were published in the late 30s in Britain and France that there's a debate going on about marriage agencies who are taking advantage of women who try to attain citizenship by marrying men. And we, I mean, you also brought up Stefan Zweig is in fact from Austria, and how maybe this could also be an advantage in gaining citizenship when we were from Austria or from Hungary and not from Germany. Or, I mean, you also talked about class, which, I mean, middle class or upper class identity might not serve to one's advantage in a working man's paradise like Australia, but maybe in other countries. So I want to ask if you see broader patterns, or I mean, in those strategies, or if they actually existed, or if everything is whether tailored to individuals and single national experiences.
Hi, I'm Raphael. I'm a third year history undergrad. Thank you, beautiful. I was wondering, with respect to the idea of diasporic identity, for Jews that left before they were like the idea of being deported to camps versus those who went through the Holocaust and like survived the camps, do you find in your research a different approach to their diasporic identities, a difference in whether they reject or accept them differently? And does this come through in your methodological approaches? Okay.
The intersectional approach, yeah, definitely, it's definitely in my work that I just didn't include in this paper, because the one point I already made about the demographics of this group that is so different from others, and that also is not only through what the education or training was, but also a more urban population, a very different population, Jewish minority from other Jewish refugee groups, and the gender pattern was then again very similar to other migrant groups, so that women earned the money once they arrived in the countries of exile. And class, of course, also plays a role. What I try to do is to really be aware of class, gender, social factors, geographical origins, maybe, and maybe even colonial aspects in the sense of how it changes over time, or how different, how the groups or individuals learn from other groups and from other patterns of gaining citizenship, for example. You know, like coming to a country and learning, this is how you do it. So let's talk in this and that sense, or let's tell my story, narrate my story, shape my story so that it fits a pattern that's suitable for this immigration country specifically. So that's how I try to bring it in. I hope that answers your question. And about there definitely is a difference between those who made it before the war, those who made it out before 41, when immigration wasn't allowed at all anymore, so they were legal immigrants if they made it at all, and for those who were survivors. And there were even again two categories. One was those who survived the camps and the ghettos, and those who survived, let's say, in the Soviet Union, very far away in Siberia, etc., and were then having other experiences also in the question of would they reapply would they want to go back, and which back does it actually even mean? So yeah, it definitely appears. But that's a very tricky one to tackle.
Okay, we have 5 people on the list. The next 2 are Anne and Abby. So Anne.
So it's one quick question. With your exploratory work on these German Jewish diasporas, did it shape your reaction to how the British and American authorities dealt with this problem? I mean, 45 was a terribly difficult year. And do you do your exploratory work on the diasporas and come out feeling very angry with the Americans, or very angry with the Brits, or do you have an element of sympathy for the dilemma, the policy dilemmas that they had in the first 18 months after the war? Thank you.
Weizsäcker, I'm Emeritus Fellow of this college, and I have a question about the relations between Germany and Israel, specifically the doctrine of Staatsräson, German responsibility for Israel's security. Do you think that this doctrine needs to be reassessed in the light of the Israeli genocide in Gaza? It seems to me that Israel doesn't face an external threat to its security, but the real threat to Israel's security is internal authoritarianism, apartheid, Jewish supremacy, colonialism. And the best way for Germany to enhance Israeli security is not by supplying weapons to enable Israel to carry out war crimes and genocide, but it's to educate Israel about the rule-based international order, international law, and respect for human rights. So that's my opinion. But I've heard that a think tank linked to the German Foreign Ministry has produced a paper which proposes a reassessment of this doctrine, and it says that the doctrine is valid, but it should be extended. So it wouldn't be just German commitment to Israel's security, but it should also include Palestinian security. Have you heard about that, and can you throw any light on that?
Okay, thank you. And the last question, that's I'm glad you ended with this question, but there I would say that's exactly a clear yes. Actually, that's what I try to show, that the story is so interwoven that it's not possible to only look at this one angle of Israeli citizenship or Jewish belonging without also looking at those who are implicated by those certain steps. So I always, that's why I say if we look at the current developments, we have to look back and go back in history to see, to understand where it comes from. And then we will often be surprised. So when you speak of the Staatsräson, I don't know whether everyone knows what's meant by this, but it's kind of, it's basically what Paul did in his book. Not what you did, what you explained. You explained the origin and the basic of on which fundament in German society Staatsräson today as an understanding of we have to do good, we have to be responsible for what we did as a collective in the past, and therefore we have to act accordingly. So the question is, what does the accordingly mean? And accordingly doesn't necessarily, I don't want to talk about my opinion here, but I would say accordingly doesn't never always mean one thing. It can be answered in different ways. And Staatsräson has a very clear way, which is we send weapons, we invite Netanyahu, etc. Staatsräson can also be, we are aware of both, of the origins of the current conflict and of the German responsibility for all those affected by the current conflict. That would be my interpretation of Staatsräson, of how I would wish it to be. So from this, you already hear that I'm not, there is some opinionated note here to hear probably. But one last remark to this, the legislation law that I mentioned by Esther von Weizsäcker that she issued with is actually part and parcel of this, but in a very good sense. And I would just be glad if the German governing body at some point would open its door legislatively also to other groups who live in Germany and want to live in Germany to be an easier accessible nation. As for the US and the UK, well, Paddington is of course full of this nostalgia and of this warm welcome. The Kindertransport, young kids were brought in and does not mention those who were left out or those walls that were erected. Does it also not mention the experience of being interned as an enemy alien, although you had just fled from the country that's basically the enemy. However, I try to always be as matter-of-factly as possible. But you will certainly once in a while find me steaming when I read those things. But I always try also to look at the context. And then the context, of course, is very complicated. And that's why I said at some point that I always try to only look at Germany as a national context, because otherwise I would not be able to bring in biographical case studies from even 10 different countries, because I would need to know really the national context of 10 different countries. But I have it in my mind. Did I answer all? Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so we have a last round of three. Abigail, Nick, and Timo. Abigail, please.
Yeah, so
Introduce yourself, by the way. Back.
I'm
Called you.
Abigail Green. Yes, I'm a Jewish historian. I had, I guess, so first of all, as a 19th century historian, this is just a comment. I feel that quote by Stefan Zweig, although engaging, it really does not sit right with me. It does not seem to describe at all the situation. Yeah. And one can think of so many examples of statelessness, which were very problematic for people who were stateless in the 19th century. For example, the Romanian Jews who had their citizenship taken away by the formation of the Romanian state. That's, and there were about 100,000, not more. So, I just would not start there, because the more I think about it, the more problems I see with it, and I just think it's not a good idea. I also wanted to pick up on this point, the point you made about other kinds of diaspora. And I think this comparative perspective is perhaps illuminating if you want to think about the experiential. Just because inevitably I found myself thinking about my own experience as someone who recently reclaimed my Portuguese identity. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the process of your whole model is about people moving away from the homeland. But the process of reclaiming, even if there's an incredibly long distance, changes that relationship fundamentally, because actually citizenship is not just an entry card to the European Union or a piece of paper. You get caught up into the bureaucratic processes of the state of which you are a member. You find yourself constantly visiting the consulate or the embassy. You have to renew your passport. All their systems are in a different language, so you begin to think you might need to learn that language. So I think you need to kind of consider that aspect of return as well, rather than this, oh, well, there are lots of people who are claiming it, but they're not necessarily planning to activate it, because I think it's not so simple. Mm-hmm. And there's a process of redefinition, actually, because our family always thought we were Italian Jews, but we've recently re-identified ourselves as Portuguese. But of course, we're really British.
That's a common one of the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to skip Nick Stargard. I work on Nazi Germany, and my father was indeed one of these German Jews who died in Austria in 1939. Months later, became an enemy 2 years after that became stateless. But I don't want to talk about the biographical. I'm actually more interested in what your talk tells us about how we should think about state law and international law, really. Because 20 or 30 years ago, when I first started thinking about the relationship between nation building and ways in which identities were defined in the early 20th century, there were very simple models. They were sort of Foucauldian models of universal us or them, in or out. And they're sort of Rogers Brubaker's stylized versions of the French Revolution, where it's either you're Sully or you're Sanguini. Whereas actually the way that you tell it, that tradition turns into the universal rationales of international institutions and human rights. But it's not what states do. States actually never stop creating very complicated ancien regime type demarcations between rights which are extended to one group of people, but for complicated reasons can't be extended to other groups of people, which is, of course, very much the world in which politicians are talking all the time now about who should be allowed in, who should not be allowed in. And it does make me feel like we're actually right back in the Habsburg Empire that we haven't really checked. And it is about these very particularist rights. And what struck me all the way through your talk is this constant intermeshing in people's sense of identity between the particularism of the group that they might belong to. And they're both needing and simultaneously rejecting the universalist language, which they have to invoke. They don't really want it to justify to them, as Johanna Arendt famous quote is, it's the worst kind of rights. Best kind are actually the particularist ones. And I just wondered whether that actually is worth thinking about and reconceptualizing how we talk about citizenship and national identity. Those models of the 1990s and early 2000s, which came at a moment of liberal optimism, are simply wrong. They're historically wrong, and they don't really describe, even in ideal type fashion, what we're really dealing with.
Thanks for sharing your research. My question is quite short. I'm just curious that you didn't mention much East Germany. So I was wondering what would be the role, or is there a role for East Germany for the diaspora community or East Germany as an agency?
Okay. There we go. Great. You're absolutely right with the reclaiming of, no, let's start with the Zweig quote. Then I was just too short in introducing the Zweig quote, because that's exactly what I want to show. But it's not matter of factly what he describes. Of course, it's his personal reflection, and it tells us something about him in the situation in which he writes that. It does not tell us anything about how it has been. Also because, of course, could he cross any border because he had wealth and papers, right? So, of course, it's an illusion. But I'm interested more in why does he write this explicitly at this time? So I would never take it as a document for how it was in the 19th century, which also brings me, of course, to it connects to Nick's question, and I'm going to come back to the reclaiming. The Habsburg Empire, actually, it wasn't simple in the sense of simple to belong. It was just simple in the sense of it was all about keeping those out that one didn't want to take care of. So it's very simplistically put, but like the Habsburg Empire had the category of belonging through the Heimatschein, and you applied for a Heimatschein in your municipality, we would probably say today, which meant that if you would fall poor at some point, the municipality would take care of you. So it was like the secularized version of what Jewish or other religious communities would do for their members. So I would never say it was easy, and I'm sure you also didn't mean to say that, but the interesting thing about international law is, of course, who's enforcing it. Like how is it being defended? How is human rights as a category? How can they be defended? And so that's why I always have to look, and that's why I stayed with a West German case, that I look at the inner German debates on ratification matters for United Nations conventions. Because of course it affects the nation state level once one says, okay, we are signing this treaty for human rights. Well, what does it mean on the ground? Like how come there are still stateless people in Germany? In theory, it wouldn't even, shouldn't be possible at all. And another answer, of course, between the state law and international law can be found in the World Federalist movement, I would say, which is like maybe a second edition of empires, in the sense of there's a global world. There's actually a wonderful Superman strip of after 45 where it's about world citizenship, and Superman declares himself a world citizen, which upsets many US Americans because he's, of course, anyway, I'm not going to go into this, but so the World Federal Movement always needed the nation state protection. And that's what Hannah Arendt meant. So I look more into the nation state level in order to understand how international law worked. Maybe I could put it that way. And East Germany, I'll just use the easy way now and say, no, I'm not dealing with it, which is really just the easy way because I'm getting tired and it's much more complicated. And also the Jewish context, it's ever more complicated because many of the leftist Jews went back. So the German Jewish lefty diaspora reacted completely different to the non-leftist one. The reclaiming of citizenship, maybe I'll take that as the final remark because it brings me also to revoking of citizenship. So both aspects are really something I look at very closely, actually, at how it works, how those processes really work. Because the aspect of reclaiming citizenship also always brings in the element of deciding to not reclaim your citizenship. So I always look at both those procedures, but only till roughly beginning of the 60s, because otherwise it would become too complicated. But I would nevertheless love talking with you about how you reclaimed that citizenship, because that's even more interesting if you have this imaginary, if I may say so, citizenship. I don't know in your case, but in some cases,
it's not imaginary.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Is that okay? I think at this stage we're slightly in extra time. We can go upstairs. There's wine and some nipples for people. I'm going to continue the conversation, speak to Mary about that. Those that are coming for high table tonight will assemble outside the European Study Center at 7 o'clock, in about 10, 12 minutes. But before we disperse, please join me in thanking Miriam for some private